Stroop, hissed Heinrich Himmler like a snake down the telephone line from Berlin. You must at all costs bring down those two flags. SS Brigadeführer Jürgen Stroop straightened himself, his gloved hand tightening around the receiver in anger. Zu Befehl, Herr Reichsführer, he snapped back stiffly before replacing the telephone in its cradle. Walking a few hundred yards from his command post to the so-called front line, Stroop narrowed his blue eyes and stared up at a tall building in Warsaw's Muranowski Square. Black smoke was drifting across the sky from the many burning buildings, but in the breaks between each gust, Stroop could make out the two flags that had Germany's second most powerful man in a rage. Two young Jewish boys who had fearlessly braved the German gunfire had erected the flags the day before. One was the red and white Polish national flag. The other, the banner of the Jewish resistance organization known as ZZW, the Jewish Military Union. It consisted of a blue Star of David on a white background, today's Israeli flag. Stroop, personally appointed by Himmler to crush the Warsaw Ghetto revolt, pulsed with fury. He knew the power of flags. It reminded hundreds of thousands of the Polish cause, it excited them and unified the population of the general government, but especially Jews and Poles, he wrote afterwards. A flag was worth 100 machine guns in a situation like this. Stroop would topple those flags, just like he would crush the Jews who had had the temerity to make a stand against the Third Reich. The ragtag army of Jewish terrorists, as he called them, who had already managed to throw the Germans out of the ghetto, would be utterly destroyed. This was Stroop's almost pathological determination. That he was also fighting women and children made no impression on him whatsoever. With such cold-hearted warriors, Himmler prosecuted his destruction of the Jews. The Warsaw Ghetto was the largest of the many ghettos created for the Jews by the Germans. A tiny part of the Polish capital that measured only 1.3 square miles had been fenced and walled off and housed between 300 and 400,000 people in squalid, overcrowded conditions. Disease and malnutrition had already killed thousands before the Nazis decided to reduce the population dramatically by shipping tens of thousands of inmates east under Aktion Reinhard, the SS plan to kill all of the Jews of Poland. SS und Polizeiführer Odilo Globocnik, Nazi police leader in the Lublin district of the General Government, as the Germans called occupied Poland, had been ordered to progressively clear the ghetto, assisted by the head of the ZIPO and SD security police in Warsaw, Standartenführer Ludwig Hahn. Globocnik's surname gave away his non-German origins. Born in Trieste, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1904, to parents of Slavic origin, Globocnik served in the Austrian and Yugoslav armies before becoming a member of the banned Austrian Nazi Party. To say that Globocnik was a fanatical Nazi would have been an understatement, and he had served time in prison for his political beliefs and activities, which endeared him to Himmler. A key player in the German takeover of Austria in 1938, Globocnik was rewarded by promotion to Gauleiter of Vienna, a position he utilized to both persecute Jews and enrich himself. Caught by SS investigators with his hand in the till in 1939, Globocnik was convicted of foreign currency speculation, dismissed from his position, and reduced to a corporal in the Waffen-SS. Sent to the front in Poland, Himmler ensured that his old friend was rapidly reinstated as a top Nazi leader less than a year later, when he appointed Globocnik SS Brigadeführer and assigned him to Lublin province as higher SS and police leader. Himmler placed him in charge of the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto and a series of other major Jewish population centers, and Globocnik excelled at these tasks. The aristocratic SS Oberführer Ferdinand von Sammern-Frankenegg, who had been in command of the Warsaw area since 1941, commanded Grossaktion Warschau on the ground, as the Germans termed the ghetto clearances in Warsaw. Globocnik maintained overall charge from a safe distance. The turning point for the ghetto inhabitants occurred on the 18th of April 1942, when the SS began a process of executing inmates it deemed undesirables before commencing with its clearance of the ghetto. On the 22nd of July, the head of the Judenrat, or Nazi-appointed Jewish Council, Adam Chernyakov, was called to a meeting headed by the German Resettlement Commissioner, SS Sturmbannführer Hermann Höfler, where he was informed that mass deportations to camps in the east would commence shortly. Chernyakov, feeling that he was helpless to protect his people from what looked to be an increasingly homicidal Nazi program, committed suicide rather than cooperate and was replaced by Mark Lichtenbaum. It made no difference to Höfler's timetable. Over 8 weeks during the summer of 1942, cattle trains left the ghetto railway collection point twice daily, carrying between 5,000 and 7,000 people on each occasion east to camps, primarily the extermination center known as Treblinka. The SS recorded that a total of 310,322 Jews were evacuated from the ghetto when this action ended on the 3rd of October 1942. Although the population of the ghetto was greatly reduced, the Germans planned a second round of deportations for later in the year, and it was at this point that some of the more militant Jews decided to act. The Jewish Combat Organization, known as ZOB, was formed in October 1942 with the intention of resisting further deportations. Led by an idealistic 24-year-old named Mordechai Anielewicz, its members were under no illusions as to their fate should they rise up against the SS police state. But they felt that they had nothing to lose, as the news filtering back from the eastern camps suggested that the Germans were murdering the evacuees. The ZOB received some weapons, ammunition and supplies from the well-organized Polish Home Army, a non-Jewish national resistance movement that was heavily supported by Britain. But the weapons were nowhere near plentiful enough for the ZOB to be considered a serious threat to the Germans. The ZOB only had 220 committed fighters in Warsaw, who were armed with a miscellany of handguns, grenades, rifles, and homemade Molotov cocktails. Anielewicz divided the ghetto into sectors, sending his small number of fighters to garrison each one. So short were they of arms that each sector only had 3 rifles, and within the entire Warsaw Ghetto, the ZOB possessed just 2 landmines and 1 submachine gun with limited ammunition. More weapons would be smuggled into the ghetto once the revolt started. Some were captured from the Germans, and a few were even manufactured in secret arsenals. But the ZOB would remain vastly outnumbered and outgunned by the Germans throughout the revolt. A second ghetto resistance organization, the right-wing ZZW, received large quantities of arms, ammunition and supplies from the Polish Home Army's affiliated National Security Corps, the RKB, and on several occasions the Home Army would launch attacks on German forces that were assaulting the ghetto, trying to take some of the pressure off the ZOB and ZZW forces inside the walls that were resisting bravely. One PKB unit, led by Henryk Basti Iwanski, even fought inside the ghetto. Many of the resistors would be young women, who the Germans noted grimly fought as fiercely as their menfolk. Himmler, who had visited Warsaw in January 1943, ordered that the numerous armaments factories that had been established inside the ghetto, along with their Jewish laborers and machines, should be transferred to Lublin. The process began on the morning of the 18th of January, when the temperature was minus 20 degrees Celsius. Grey army trucks loaded with 200 SS and 800 Ukrainian and Latvian SS auxiliaries roared into the center of the ghetto. The roundup was timed to catch the 35,000 Jewish slave laborers on their way to work in the factories. The SS fired indiscriminately into the crowds before beginning to corral large numbers of people preparatory to marching them to the railhead. The sudden Nazi action caught the Jewish resistance organizations completely off guard. Trying to recover, they broke out their meager supply of weapons or armed themselves with pipes, sticks, and bottles. The Germans soon had long columns of Jews being herded towards the train depot when Anielewicz's fighters suddenly opened fire. Whilst the stunned SS reacted to completely unexpected Jewish resistance, another group of SS stormed a building where a ZOB commander, Itzhak Zuckerman, and 40 of his fighters were holed up. Zuckerman had placed 2 armed lookouts in the large building's foyer, and they carefully took no notice as the SS swaggered through the main door and started for the staircase. Suddenly, one of the lookouts pulled out a revolver and shot 2 of the Germans in the back. The rest of the SS men, shocked and suddenly wrong-footed by this act of resistance, retreated from the building in some disarray, with the rest of Zuckerman's fighters in pursuit. 1 more SS man was wounded in the intense gunfight that followed. At Gestapo headquarters there was considerable consternation. The action was a complete failure, the Germans only managing to snatch 5,000 Jews instead of the 50,000 they had planned. Von Sammern-Frankenegg was humiliated. The Germans were aware that Poland's resistance organization, the Home Army, numbered over 380,000 well-armed personnel, and throughout the occupation they feared what would happen if it rose against Nazi rule. The fear was that this sudden resistance by Jewish terrorists, as the SS labeled them, could spread to the non-Jewish Polish population. The Home Army was indeed watching events in Warsaw with interest and was impressed by the bloody nose that a handful of poorly armed Jewish fighters had managed to inflict on Hitler's master race. But the Home Army would refuse all entreaties to join in with the ghetto rising, preferring to wait until events favoured them. That is, until the Red Army arrived close to the Polish capital, an event that in January 1943 was judged to be a long time off. The Jewish leadership demanded weapons and ammunition to supplement what they had bought or manufactured, and in February the Home Army gave the ZOB 50 pistols and some hand grenades. The ZOB organized itself for the defense of the Warsaw Ghetto. The problem for the fighters was that the ghetto was not contiguous. Rather, since the mass deportations of 1942, large areas were empty of people and businesses. The ghetto was now divided into 3 separate parts, separated by depopulated zones. The ZOB split into 3 regiments, 1 for each sector, with the regiments subdivided into squadrons of varying sizes. 9 squadrons under the command of Anielewicz garrisoned the large center ghetto, 8 under Zuckerman the area of the Tobens and Schultz armaments factories, and 5 under Mark Edelman in the smaller brushmakers district on the western edge of the center ghetto. In total, the ZOB now fielded about 500 fighters. Such was the dire shortage of weapons that at this stage only 1 in 10 of the fighters actually had a firearm. Messages were sent again to the Polish Home Army asking for more weapons, whilst teams went around the ghetto collecting old bottles and burned out light bulbs to be converted into Molotov cocktails. Drain pipes were cut up and converted into rudimentary grenades, and a trickle of guns were bought off the Polish black market and smuggled into the ghetto. The ZOB and ZZW also conducted some house cleaning. They had executed those members of the Quisling Jewish ghetto police that remained, and also any Gestapo or Abwehr intelligence agents that had infiltrated the ghetto, a number that sadly included a member of the Judenrat. The Jewish resistance leaders knew that the Germans would return and avenge their loss of face, as well as try to round up the workers they demanded, so it was essential that the fighters construct bunkers from which to mount a prolonged defense of the ghetto. Anielewicz criticized the bunker mentality of many of his co-leaders and instead pressed that the Jews use the upper stories and roofs of tall residential buildings to dominate the Germans. His argument prevailed, and ZOB units took post high up over the streets, as well as helping to construct bunkers and tunnels down below. Von Sammern-Frankenegg was under considerable pressure from his superiors to get on with clearing the ghetto. Perhaps overconfident of his troops' ability to complete the task, and with little combat experience of his own, von Sammern-Frankenegg decided to break into the ghetto on the 19th of April and complete the task that he had been set. On the morning of the 19th, the ZOB and other Jewish resistance groups were on high alert after word had reached them of German troops massing near the ghetto entrances. This time the Jews would not be taken by surprise. From their posts on the edge of the brushmakers' district, Jewish lookouts reported an awe-inspiring and terrifying sight. Hundreds of SS troops were forming up into companies. The ring of their jackboots on the streets was loud and portentous, while behind them came a fleet of army trucks, a couple of tanks, some armoured half-tracks, light artillery pieces, and motorcyclists. The Germans clearly meant business. Even further back, the lookouts reported SS ambulances and field kitchens setting up. Communication trucks with tall radio masts were also observed. For the handful of Jewish fighters, it was a terrible moment. These poorly armed civilians, with only the most rudimentary training, were about to face highly disciplined and motivated SS troops, who outnumbered them many times over and had an awesome array of support weapons available. As the lookouts watched and listened to the crunch of marching boots, the growl of diesel and petrol engines, and the squeal of tank tracks on city roads, the SS started singing. The Nazi Party anthem, the Horst Wessel song, carried into the ghetto, the sound of death approaching. Tune in next time to find out if the ghetto fighters can stop the fearsome SS assault. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my video channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.